Thank you very much for joining us again on this very important last session for today. As I just mentioned, several issues for the energy transition to succeed need to be tackled, and certainly without the next one, the social issues and how to deal with the transition in the affected regions, it won't be a success. So it's very important to get this right, and this is what the last session is focused on. I just wanted to mention for the challenge, for the prize-winning challenge that we started during the break, we have roughly an equivalent amount of industry representatives, research representatives, also from government, the people there, and from civil society. At the moment, I think the bilateral open source energy modeling between Australia and Germany slightly is biased towards the research perspective, so I would encourage the industry people to step up and propose the big cooperation projects that in the end the governments can fund. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jan Minks. Professor Jan Minks is one of the co-directors of the Energy Transition Hub. He is also a group leader at the MacArthur Institute in Berlin and is a professor for public policy and climate change at the Priestley Center for Climate Change at the University of Leeds. Professor Jan Minks has been in the past the lead and the head of the technical support unit in the IPCC Working Group 3. For those of you who don't know about this, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Working Group 3 deals with the mitigation issues. How can we ramp down emissions and address all these issues? So we are very privileged to have Professor Jan Minks today with us, and he will introduce the other speakers. Thank you very much, and join me in welcoming Jan Minks.
Thank you, Malte. It's a pleasure for me to be here. This is really, I think, an important session, and it's particularly also a session where I think nobody can say that we have a silver bullet. And therefore, I think it's really important that we keep our time here, and we swore to each other before the session that we would do so, and we agreed on a very rigid time management system so that we can open the floor and get all the expertise that is here. With the Energy Hub, I think just one thing to highlight is that I think what we try to do is to do not only world-class research. That is, of course, as researcher, our ambition, but we also want to reach out to society, and I think this is one occasion, but we also had roundtables in Australia, we had roundtables in Germany where we want to have similar dialogues. So informing policy, reaching out, having stakeholder events, I think it's a crucial thing that we want to achieve. But as I said, I don't want to say too much. I will give a brief I will give some brief introductory remarks, but before that, I want to introduce the panel. So first of all, I would like to introduce James Hay. He's the Deputy Secretary, Energy, Climate Change and Sustainability in the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. He is such an excellent contribution to this panel because he has also 10 years of experience in the private sector in investment in renewables. He has experience in private and public sectors, in other private and public sectors. So I'm really happy that we have him. So James, please come up. Next is Karen Kane. She's the Chief Executive Officer at the Latrobe Valley Authority, which brings together local people, industry, education providers, and all levels of government to secure the economic, social, and environmental future of the Latrobe Valley. She has significant experience working across government, leading strategic innovation and developing and implementing policy in the public sector. So let us welcome Karen. So please join as well. Then, yeah, sorry. I'm too much in my rigid time management mood. So we should have some time for applause. So apologies. So then there's Stefan Kapferer. You know him already. He's the chairman of the General Executive Management Board of the General Federal Association of the Energy and Water Industry. Before, he was Deputy Secretary General of the OECD and held state secretary positions in economic affairs and also health. Welcome, Stefan. I'm also very happy to introduce Luke Heywood to you. He is my colleague at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin, where he is a research associate. His research focuses on concerns on the consequences of the coal exit for directly or indirectly affected workers, and he is an expert in evaluating public policy in general, with a specific focus also on labor market issues. So welcome, Luke. And last but not least, we have Amanda Cahill. She's the founder and CEO of Next Economy. She has spent over 2 decades working with communities across Australia, Asia, and the Pacific on community and economic development projects. Over the last 5 years, she has been working with communities across Australia to strengthen regional economies by embracing the transition from fossil fuels to a zero-emissions economy. Welcome, Amanda. And I think we all agree that this is an excellent panel to discuss this issue of just transition together. Let me just make a few introductory remarks before we go into a discussion with the panelists. So, and I think if we think about, just transitions, energy transitions, I think one of the big framing at the end of the day is climate change, and that was one of the major findings of IPCC Working Group 2 on climate impacts. And it says basically that the observed impacts of climate change are widespread and consequential. The picture shows you reefs. So the reefs are very sensitive. They will not take much more warming, but of course we have also more robust systems. But overall, we all experience already today, and that was a strong message of AR5, that we have more natural disasters, we have more flooding, etc., etc. And at the same time, at the global level, our only experience is that emissions are rising and rising and rising. And I think this needs to change. In Germany and Australia, we are reducing emissions, but not fast enough. In other countries as well. So even the NDCs that are put forward by the countries are not sufficient to bring us back on track towards limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. And this is something we have to work on, because if we continue like this, we are going into a 3, 4, 5 degree world. And I think the IPCC has made very clear that this is a planet that would be very unfriendly to live on, to put it mildly, and that we can reduce those risks. We cannot avoid any risk, but we can reduce those risks substantially by keeping warming below well below 2 degrees. And I think this was so important because also the governments of Australia and Germany signed to that mission, and I think that is our central framing. We are all committed to limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. And so the next question then is, how does such a transition look like? And I just want to show it with one example, 2 degree pathways. So if you look at the black line at the top, that's the baseline, and any 2 degree scenario, even any 2.5 degree scenario, any 1.5 and any 3 degree scenario is a fundamental departure from business as usual. And I think, so thinking about transitions and how we organize them are crucial. If we want to actually achieve the Paris goals, we need to achieve net zero during the 21st century, and that means we actually need to be pretty fast. If we want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we already need to be at net zero by 2050. That's a pretty robust finding. So this means we are thinking about transitions that are really rapid and deep and transformational. And so we are thinking about rapid and comprehensive change, and this is a central framing of our sessions. And the European Union has actually said that we can do this by being a prosperous, modern, competitive, and carbon neutral economy. And I equally believe so. And I think this session is also about seeing how this can be done. I want to use this opportunity also to show a little bit how the hub fits into this. I've already said we are interested in informing policy, but also doing relevant research. And I think there are basically three pillars of our work. I think one is technology, thinking about technology, how they can be brought to the market, where they are in the development process. So, for example, on the issue of CO2 removal, in one of our reports, you will see that we have done work where we show that some critical technologies there are already delayed. So I think these are kind of things we are researching on the technology level, but I think we are also stressing that this needs to be complemented by a systems perspective. So we need to think about how the different dots connect, what a particular technology then in the end will be able to deliver. We need to think about which technology is competitive, but also how they interact with each other. So sector coupling, for example, is one important aspect. And the third one is policy assessment. We really need to understand what works, under what conditions, and why. And I think that's a third component that we are concerning ourselves with. But now I want to lead into the sessions. So when we are thinking about managing transitions, I think I would like to discuss mainly two aspects, the opportunities, and we have discussed some of the opportunities already today around new markets, new industries, new technologies, sustainable investments, etc. But we also need to talk about just transitions, so about the issue of not leaving people behind, communities behind, industries behind, and this is what this session is about. And therefore, I now want to start with the questions. That's already it from me. And I would like to start with James. So maybe I'm moving up and moving to this microphone, if this is okay. So, James, the Lower House Committee of Environment and Planning is conducting an inquiry into the sustainability and energy supply and resources in New South Wales, including the economic opportunities of renewables, emerging trends in supply and exports, and the role government policies can play to support communities affected by changing markets. New South Wales faces the prospect of the closure of the Little coal-fired power station and a significant increase in wind and solar. Could you tell us a little bit what are the main questions regarding the role of the state government, local government, and asset owners in supporting communities affected by the transitions, and what policy instruments are being used and contemplated to facilitate the transition in now New South Wales?
Sure. In New South Wales, I have key priorities in three. There's the reliability, affordability, and lower emissions. And as we see this transition, we're organised around that. And recently, after the recent state elections, there was a major reorganisation of the state government. For the first time since 2010, the energy and environment portfolios are being combined, and my role was established, which is as DEPSEC, climate change, energy, sustainability, and the circular economy. And so that's the Premier's priority, to ensure that the government is focused on integrating those bits of advice. So it's kind of starting at the top with the allocation of portfolios, and it's the reorganisation of the department around that. So in an essence, so if I then maybe just touch on a couple of the things in reliability, we've heard a lot today. We've got fewer ageing plants. Reliability is critical to customers. So all these three elements are critical to all the customers in the network, and it's what the government has recognised as being demanded of the network. So in that area, we've got a significant less resilience in our network. We've got higher consequence events. The ageing plant, if it fails, will take longer, if at all, to repair. And that's got to leave time for the development of the renewable energy zones and the other alternatives and technologies that are going. So one of the programs that you'll hear a bit about in the next weeks, I hope, will be the Emerging Energy Program, which is an $75 million program, part of which was an election commitment from our government to use some of the climate change fund plus some other funds to bring forward the feasibility and construction of new dispatchable forms of energy. And it's aimed for lower emission, but it is not specifically renewables. It's about making sure we've got dispatchable generation in the system. The emissions will be a key factor in the criteria because it's a climate change fund program, but it is about bringing forward the security we have to be confident that as we move forward, we can continue to enjoy the reliability that we've had to date. Customers and politicians therefore demand a higher reliability than we've ever expected before. We do have some regulatory settings that we're working on in terms of answering the question as well, and there's a reliability standard in the industry that really doesn't, I don't think, address the current context. So we're looking and working with across governments and with the federal government around how we can better affect a reliability standard, and particularly with AEMO and others on that. We're working on transmission investments, and that involves working quite closely with local government across, because transmission clearly is long distance and covers many territories. For that, we use instruments like critical state significant infrastructure status to ensure that those investments can come online in time and give the reliability that transmission gives in a capacity sense, particularly in summer months. We've got 4 key transmission projects in that respect. I probably don't need to go into those. Affordability, if I go on to the affordability, it's a critical element and it's very important to us. And in that we have tools that we're using ranging from a significant amount of rebates. And one of the programs that is about to launch as well is solar for low-income houses. And there in New South Wales, if you're eligible for a low-income rebate, which is $285 a year, you have the option of converting that into the right to have some solar installed in your house. And it's a 10-year program. It's not a loan. It's just simply a conversion of that. We estimate for the average eligible house, they will save $600 a year rather than the $285 they get from the rebate program. So we think that's a much more constructive future-proofing of the economy than just paying a rebate that sort of gets washed through the retailers. We think that's a much more constructive way of doing it. So we're trying to think about rebates in a much more whole of system way. As part of that program, we'll be aiming to try and ensure that the virtual power plants are enabled and all sorts of other technology is factored in as well. So I guess the point that I'd really point out for this is the social license. And it's a concept that we focus on a lot. All forms of energy generation, transmission, and even distributed energy have a footprint. It's unavoidable. Whether they're renewable, whether they're not, they have a footprint. And I think there's a lot of, I've spent decades doing renewable generation projects. The first utility scale wind in Australia and New Zealand. I'm currently director of a company that does renewables throughout the Pacific. And that social license is just critical, and I think we assume we've got it. So our plans with the renewable energy zones is to ensure we've got it, to ensure that they can actually deliver the capacity that we're anticipating they'll deliver to help the transition. So that's going right from the basic planning, strategic planning, through to the industry regulation. But I think the industry gets too preoccupied with its own regulation, its RIT-Ts and everything else, and it doesn't think about the fact that energy has to coexist in society and has to earn a license to produce. So we'll be continuing to work in that area as well. Time's up. I can go on. He did tell me this thing's a taser. But I'm happy to. And maybe I'll just touch on the emissions.
Very briefly.
For those who follow government estimates processes. The Premier confirmed last week in her estimate session that the 2050 net zero target is not an aspirational target, it is a commitment the government's made. We're working very hard on how we deliver that, how we think about that, and we're thinking about it in decades as to what's required now, how do we invest now for the next decades, how do we focus on innovation. We've heard a lot about hydrogen, and you'll see a lot more thinking coming out in that area too. The overall aim, as we call it, is to have resilient and thriving communities.
Thank you so much. Karen, you have a different experience. You have been working with the Latrobe Valley Authority that tries to bring local people together with industry, education providers, and all levels of governments. And that is in the context of the closure of the Heywood power station. Can you briefly summarize how your work has helped workers and businesses affected by the closure, and what we can learn from these experiences in facilitating transitions?
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So for those people who are not aware, Latrobe Valley is about 2 hours east of Melbourne. It has been the major power generator for the state for decades, so a long history in the community. So the authority was set up by the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and I think the model of that authority is probably important to this discussion. So we are a local team of local people. We are based in the valley, we're there every day. We also have a small team here in Melbourne that helps us bring the top down and bottom up connection between government. So the closure of Hazelwood was a short-term announcement announced in November 2016, closed in March the following year. The authority started in November. So very important to understand, first of all, the direct impact on the community, direct impact on workers, and direct impact on businesses associated with that closure. One of the important ways in which we've worked, which I think is really important, is that the authority is to facilitate, our role is to facilitate and collaborate partnerships in the community. And you mentioned the sectors that we work with, and we do that deliberately and carefully. So one of the other things that's really important is to listen and understand what the needs are of workers and business, and that's the work we did. So rather than the authority providing the work, we brought together people who are directly involved immediately in providing support for workers who may have been out of a job. So it's all the natural organisations in the community whose that's part of their core business, the higher ed and skills and training people who would be a real partner, the Gippsland Trade and Labour Council, very important, us working with unions and their members, community groups, adult education organisations, and a whole range of other support services in a partnership, a formal partnership, all providing support for individual workers. We had an entry and customised understanding, and it wasn't just for workers, it was for families as well, because this impacts families. So over 1,500 people have been supported in that way. And the other important part is that as you listen to what workers' needs are, you need to adjust and adapt the services that are provided. So we've been able to very quickly do that. We've had the ability to be creative, to be responsive. We've had the funds and the authority to do that. And it's really been very much listening to what people's needs are and not have assumptions about that. So we've adjusted those services over time, and there was an open door on that. People could walk in and talk immediately to somebody who was skilled in dealing with the angst and the grief and all of the things that come with that disruption. What that has led to us, we've had a common database. We've been able to learn about the skills of 1,500 people now, and we've now understood what the transition then looks like into transferring skills into other growth sectors. That work continues, and workers can stay connected to that for as long as they need. So very personalised. That has enabled us to think about, as I said, where the growth sectors are now into business and how we support workers into those opportunities. In terms of business, we worked very closely with another state department, Regional Development Victoria, who had the responsibility for supporting 55 businesses directly impacted by that closure. And bringing in consultants to really work directly with the owners of that business to understand their business. And if you think about decades of a very static economy here, with contracts that have never changed, what we discovered from that is that businesses have never had to be innovative. They've had a very set business model all of that time and had not given any thought about any change in their business model. So not only understanding that, then providing a coaching about how to do that. So that's the direct supply chain. We're also now working, well, we've gone from immediate support and response into recovery. We're 2.5 years in now, and we're really into long-term strategic work now. So when we start to talk about the bigger ideas, it's understanding where the growth sectors are, where the competitive edge is for our community in terms of the economy, but it's making sure that everyone in the community has the opportunity to participate in that. So the strategic work now is working with all of the sectors to understand how we focus on those opportunities in a collective, collaborative way. And our job now is to really build collaboration and capability in the community with the people who will lead this work, which is our community. So it is complex work, it is systems and innovation work, and a whole of community approach. Transition's not just about workers and business, very important, but it's about every social network in our community understanding where they sit. And we've worked with a very comprehensive approach to building the social networks in every aspect of community life. There's much more that I could talk to you about, but we're very pleased. The sentiment, we've been measuring sentiment. We've just done a check-in, and we're now having consistently people saying, we know we need to collaborate, we know we need to innovate, and we're now feeling much stronger about the future of our community.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think this... I guess this issue of regional regeneration, I'm sure will come up, and it's, I think, a hugely important aspect of this whole thing. Stefan Kapfer, you and your organization have a lot of experiences with energy transitions. I would say we had kind of different phases to it. We had the hard coal exit, which was also part of an energy transition, right? We had the feed-in tariffs where we saw rapid learning and wind and solar, but also came with some challenges. We had the nuclear phase-out, and now we have the coal commission. So this is a kind of a rich set of experience. What are the crucial lessons from Germany on how to organize such a transition in a good and a just way? Because I would say fairness issue arise in most parts, or in most of those examples.
First of all, some of you may be surprised that I'm back at stage again after the morning session. I was surprised too when the ministry called me on Monday, because when you look at the agenda from last week, a representative of the German trade unions would sit here, who worked also in the Coal Commission. You know, I'm a chairman of an industry association and since decades a member of a pro-business Liberal Party in Germany, so that's a surprise maybe. But at the same time, it's a clear proof for this kind of cooperation we developed in the so-called Coal Commission to organize the transition process. And only a few remarks, because the compromise of the Commission was often criticized in Germany, mainly criticized by people who were pro-coal, but not criticized due to the situation that we phase out coal power plants. They criticized that this is a very expensive compromise organized by the Commission. So it is interesting to look a little bit more in detail for which reasons we spend a lot of money to make this compromise work. And most of the money is given to the regions. I mentioned in the morning that there are 3 regions, 2 of them in the former eastern part of Germany. And please don't forget that these regions were affected by a disruptive transformation process only 30 years ago, after reunification in Germany. In these regions, thousands, 10,000 of employment opportunities were lost. of course, due to the situation that these jobs were not competitive. But in the mindset of the people living in these areas, and most of the people living in these areas now lived there also in 1989, this was a very disruptive process, and there is a lot of concern that this kind of disruption will come again. It is not a problem to organize a phase out of coal faster when we look only at the interests of the companies engaged in this business. Felix Mattes was mentioning in his debate that organizing it by a higher CO2 price would be a very fast process. But the effect and the impact to the region is the same. So also with a higher CO2 price system in Europe, we would have to spend billions and billions of euros in these regions to organize a transformation of this area. And when you are traveling around in Germany and you're traveling a little bit in western part of Germany and in the eastern part of Germany, you will notice that, for example, the infrastructure is much better in the eastern part of Germany. But also now, and you have seen it in the last federal states results in the eastern part of our country, also now many people in these former GDR believe that they were forgotten by politics in Berlin. And that's something we have to have in mind when we talk about transforming not only the energy system, which is ambitious, but you can work on it. When we talk also about transforming regions affected by these aspects. And we all know, also when we spend billions of euros, we will not solve the situation that we need new industrial workplaces in this area in 2 or 3 years. And this in a country like Germany, where we had hundreds of thousands new industrial workplaces every year in the last 5, 6 years. But these workplaces are concentrated in the urban metropolitan areas, in some well-industrialized western parts of our country. So that's not easy. To do. And one last remark. We discussed in the Commission, and I think this is a very relevant aspect, which is also focused on the proud of these areas, that we are interested to establish new energy-related industrial workplaces in this area because people feel they are energy regions. They did mining for decades, they did power generation for decades. So when we discuss about a hydrogen power to gas technology in Germany with subsidies, we should discuss to do so in these areas. When we discuss where are areas for new investments in renewable energy, we should do it especially in these regions. When we invest in new gas power plants to organize the stability of the energy supply in Germany, we should invest in these regions.
I mean, that's close to being art. My little daughter always says when something is very good, that's art, Dad. So thank you very much, Stefan. Now, Luke, you have looked at coal transitions from the scientific perspective, and given that we have to achieve net zero, that we have to do a lot more of transitioning over the next decades, how would you evaluate coal transitions from your point of view? I think you have some slides, right?
Should I go in that direction? Yeah. Perfect. Great, perfect, that works. Great, so I promised to evaluate German coal transition policies in 5 minutes. But before I start my 5 minutes, I'd like to give a very brief sort of background overview. And it's very interesting what Stefan Kapferer was just saying. I think that's a really interesting perspective to have in mind. I would argue coal is very much a state affair in Germany. That's very important to understand it, and that's the reason why transition policies have been influenced very heavily by interest groups. And then I give a specific example of policies that we've evaluated at our institute. We already mentioned the hard coal transition. So this took 60 years. hard coal was nationalized at the beginning of the 1960s, and the transition then took 60 years. Federal government decided prices, output, and employment. And so this makes the transition we're talking about now, 20 years, look quite short. And this is, again, something people have in the back of their minds. So the Coal Commission report explicitly mentions what happened to hard coal. Now, brown coal is a little bit less politically managed, but it's also very heavily regulated. You have to remember we have a national grid. It's very much dependent on German and European, in fact, electricity regulations. There's no exports from the German coal industry at all, so we don't depend at all here on world coal prices. So coal depends on domestic policy only, really, and that has created this feeling that there's a strong state responsibility when we're talking of a coal exit, okay? So this responsibility is interpreted maybe a little bit too much as compensating the losers of a transition out of coal. So the regions got the vast majority, as was just mentioned, the regions got the vast majority of the proposed subsidies in the Coal Commission proposals. The coal industry is ongoing, there's ongoing negotiations with the government, how much they should get for closing down their coal-fired power plants. The workers, I'll talk about that in a second, and as was already mentioned, the 1990s were really catastrophic and very, very different from the situation now. Okay, so we really had tens of thousands of jobs lost in a short period of time at a time of high unemployment. The situation is very different now. But the aim of these transition policies often has been to build coalitions, not necessarily to have a sort of vision for the future, a sustainable strategy. And I think that's important to keep in the back of your minds. And I would suggest it's quite important to actually evaluate these policies before and after implementing them. And so that's what I'm going to do. But before I talk about what we're doing at MCC, maybe the sort of broad picture of different kinds of policies which have been evaluated. In general, the literature is quite positive about investments in universities, services, so logistics, energy have been quite important in West Germany, in the hard coal industry. Infrastructure investments there, generally viewed positively. The idea that we have to reindustrialize, we just heard it again, I must say. Germany, as all rich countries, is deindustrializing. It might not look that way, but it is happening. Service sector jobs can be good. They're not always good. Maybe we should try and make them better. But there's been some big failures here as well. Some large plants which were subsidized very heavily, which went belly up in these regions. Many of the policies, I would argue, are costly, as has been mentioned, and not necessarily very transparent. And now I want to give you an example of what we've done. The Coal Commission, in their proposals, have a policy which is early retirement for workers at the age of 58. Now, if you think of your working career, or if I think of mine, 58 might seem quite early. I'm nearly there. But actually, what we find is that's not the case. But one thing after next. Who benefits from this? Most obviously, older workers, right? So who doesn't benefit? Young workers. They don't get anything from this proposal. Who also doesn't benefit? Well, the regions don't benefit. This workforce is removed from the labor force at a time, actually, when we have labor shortages, not high unemployment in these regions. But do they actually benefit? Well, actually, what we find is currently the mean average retirement age is 58. So who benefits? Well, who's paying now? Now, the coal firms are paying for early retirement. Who's paying with these proposals? Someone else, okay? So we didn't think this. We thought these graphs are wrong. This can't be. People are retiring that early. Well, that's what we find with the data. So it can be important to evaluate the consequences of policies. And I think just in general, it's interesting to keep in mind where these kinds of processes which sort of externalize, as it were, policymaking to a different body, which is independent, does create some problems. You know, there's incentives then, there's a moral hazard problem, as we call it, incentives to slow transition down a little bit, because you can then get more out of the negotiations. It's expensive, so I think this is maybe as a response to Jan's comment, you know, net zero, huge transitions necessary. We're talking here about 20,000 workers, you know, 1% of the workforce in these regions. It's small and it's very costly, so the big transition is going to be very, very costly. Yeah, and they're not necessarily always evaluated and transparent. So let me close on a positive note.
Thank you, Luke. And now we also have Amanda. You have been concerned with trying to build prosperous local communities. So you've worked a lot with local communities that start thinking, that start taking economic development and future into their own hands. And I think you are arguing otherwise, you know, we will not be moving. So can you give us a couple of examples and reflect a little bit on their role in organizing a just transition, and what can we learn from these experiences at the regional, national, and maybe even international level?
You've left me really deflated, because we've been really wanting a coal commission or some sort of government authority to take charge of this at a time where, you know, I think you've heard Australia's in a very different position to Germany in terms of consensus on the need to transition. There isn't that generalised public support across the board, and there's a lack of political leadership, particularly at a federal level, to commit to managing that. So we've got very much a vacuum at the moment. But I guess there's a few things I want to say. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the Latrobe Valley Authority. When you're talking about good examples, I think there's so much to learn from that experience. I think it was a shame that it came after with the announcement, but there's some really interesting things to learn from it, that it's been so comprehensive that it hasn't just been focused on workers or the company, but those broader regional economic development questions, and that's been funded, that work, and for the long term, you know, initially 4 years funding, but it's going to continue on because we know there's going to be more closures coming up. So I think it's a really good example to be looking at, and to have representation from a number of different groups. I also want to acknowledge the fact that when the authority started, it was a person before you, somebody white, Kylie White, yeah. I spoke to her, and she was really smart in that, like you were saying about the 90s in Germany, the Latrobe Valley had been through the privatisation in the 90s and had been traumatised by that. So instead of going out and doing a really wide community consultation, what Kylie did was brought together every single report. And there were so many reports and transition plans that different groups had done, and she used that as the basis for moving forward rather than going out again to consult with people. But currently, in terms of looking around Australia, and I work all over Australia, mostly in coal communities, and we've been doing different things. So sometimes we're bringing together government and industry into closed-door roundtable meetings to make it safe to kind of go, well, actually, what is already happening to reduce and absorb emissions across all sectors, not just energy, and how do you see that as an economic opportunity to strengthen your regional economy moving forward? What needs to happen? We're also doing community forums to get people to understand what's involved in transition, done some work with unions and with environment groups. At the moment, I notice there's kind of, looking across the country, there's kind of 3 different ways that community stepping into that leadership gap is happening. There's kind of 3 different models. I don't think this is planned, it's just how it's sort of happening at the moment. So the first is that kind of, if you look at the Hunter, for example, and a lot of the communities where I'm working, where people are still getting their heads around, do we have to confront transition? There's lots of different groups forming. Some are kind of industry-led, some are university-led, some are community or environment groups led, and they're kind of meeting separately and they're representing different groups. And the unions are dipping in and out of those, or absent from them. But they tend to be focused on the vision question, like what is the future of this region? Do we have a future? Can we manage it? Can we learn from other examples around the world? So it's kind of messy. There's lots of discussions. Groups aren't necessarily talking to each other. That's first kind of model. I think some people are quite distressed about that in those regions, but I actually think it's also an interesting thing because different ideas are coming out of that kind of creative conflict that's happening. It's whether or not that can be brought together in a way that can move things forward in a lack of formal leadership is the question. The second model that's happened in a few places has, and I guess the best example is a place called Port Augusta, where there's actually in South Australia, where there's a huge amount of renewable energy projects going in, where they had a power station close, but they also had a local group who went to a think tank called Beyond Zero Emissions, who came up with a plan for a concentrated solar thermal plant to replace the existing coal plant. So the community coalesced around a vision, a technical idea of what could replace it. Now that concentrated solar thermal plant kind of got approval, they were looking for finance, it didn't happen. But the interesting thing is I think at last count, I think they attracted 12 completely separate renewable energy projects from companies who wanted to work there, not just because they had the infrastructure in place, but they knew that the community wanted these projects. So that community acceptance was there, and it's actually now sparked, I think, 9 projects going ahead in that region. They're at the next level of challenge though, because what I'm hearing from people is while they've got all these renewable energy projects, they're not seeing the economic benefits in terms of jobs or money coming into the community. And that's something that needs to be worked on from the renewable energy side. I'm finding places where, in Queensland, for example, coal seam gas companies and coal companies have greater social licence than renewable energy companies do, because renewable energy companies aren't consulting with people. There's no regulations to control where projects are put. Companies are not even paying rates back to the local council. They're not sponsoring the footy team. So we've got to actually do some more work on how to make sure that the industry... Oh, and the final, the final model that's just starting to... I'll be really quick. The third kind of model that's emerging is probably characterised by Liddell Power Station that has announced closure, and it's actually the company that's leading that community discussion. I know they've had very ambitious plans about doing things like citizens' juries, and they've got competitions to put in ideas for what happens with the site. I'm not sure exactly how far along they are, so I'd be interested if anyone else knows how far they've gotten with that. I think it's still early days. But what I'm actually getting a lot of energy companies say to me privately, can you help us think it through? Now government won't lead it. We care about our communities and workers. That's a good thing on one side. There's also a risk because they're only going to focus on their own company, and our work is actually going to benefit from that. And they're not going to be thinking about the broader regional context. So I think we're going to lose opportunities if we just rely on companies to have those conversations. So I think there's lots of different ways to go. What I want to leave the audience with is, despite what we're hearing at a national level, everywhere I go, and I'm talking, like I talked to people from Collie the other day in Western Australia all the way up to Townsville, people want to have this discussion about transition. On the ground, they know things are changing. They're angry that there's a complete political vacuum in terms of leadership. So there is an opportunity to start bringing different stakeholders together and move that forward. So I'd like to see maybe a community-run coal commission rather than a government one if we can't get that. Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for dealing with this annoying beeping of my mobile and for sticking to the time. Because now I think we really have some time to discuss jointly this important matter, and I would like to open the floor immediately for questions and remarks.
Yeah, sorry, as a member of the Core Commission, I need to comment on Luke because I think there are 3 major flaws in your presentation. Number 1, we had 2 extremely well-known and renowned labor market researchers in the Commission, and it is simply not true that the average retirement for the future would be maintained at the level of 58. So we and I think it's a bit very, or it's questionable if you state that we have not discussed the issue of free riding on these adaptation clauses. The second is, and I think if you really read the report, there is no major instruments for younger workers. But if you go through the report and look for qualification programs are an essential element of the recommendations. And they are simply stating it is only about the old workers because there is one major instrument. This is simply not true. There are a lot of recommendations on the qualification of the younger workers, and this is one of the essential elements of the recommendations. And the last thing, to be realistic, there will be an additional cost of 40 billion. The recommendations of the Coal Commission will save the atmosphere approximately 1 billion tons of CO2. So that means it's 40 euro per ton of CO2 regional adjustment program. I think this is not expensive if you compare these to other metrics. And I think one should always be very, very careful to blame the big numbers, because the return is 1 billion less CO2 emissions, and that's a chunk for the climate.
Thank you. Luke, do you want to respond?
Yes, with pleasure. So, concerning your first point, the average age, what I'm saying is this is the way it's currently working. This is what we see in the data. This is the way in the last 10 years this was the average age of retirement. If we have a process of employment reduction, which we want to accelerate, and that was the impression that was given of the work of the Coal Commission. The impression given was, well, what can we do to reduce employment? Well, an early retirement program. What I'm saying is the data don't show that. The data show early retirement age is probably not going to change in the future with respect to the past. Now, the counterfactual, what would the companies have done? I don't know. I'm
Sorry, but you need to have a look on the age pyramid. What the companies did during the last 10 years, this was cleaning up the balance sheet. And if you have a look how the age structures of the employees has changed during the last year, in the liberalization process, you can't project this for the future. And I think this is not a serious dealing with the data, because there has been a phase. But this has been a phase of rationalization in the liberalization process, and the companies have cleaned up their balance sheets, and this is not the counterfactual for the future. And this is not a theory. If you have really a look, and we had a careful look on the age pyramid of the employees, then this is simply not true.
I'd be very happy to have your comments in detail. We have the data of all employees who were ever employed in the coal sector. We did the precise analysis of the probability of transitioning for all the different ages of every individual, so not averages. So we actually looked at the data. So, I don't go into too much detail. So yes,
this can be discussed further. This data issue after the break.
I mean, no measure for other workers. I totally agree that there's lots of very sensible recommendations in this report. I actually read it. It's very long. But I want to give one example of a concrete measure which I think would have been very interesting. A concrete measure which would have been very interesting would have been to say, look, if you're a younger worker, you can find a new job fairly easily. Unemployment is very low. This is not something what people think. People think unemployment is very high and unemployment is the problem. Actually, unemployment is not so high. Unemployment is running around 8%. That's much, much lower than you have here in Gibbs, in the Latrobe Valley and stuff. So unemployment is not necessarily the issue. The issue is wages. These people are being offered wages 20 to 50% lower. Of course, early retirement is much more attractive then. So why don't we give people a top-up of the difference? And there's a policy which exists in Germany for older workers who are unemployed. Entgeltsicherung is called. Why don't we offer this to people in coal? This is interesting for the local labor market. This would be interesting for local industry. This is interesting for workers. And it doesn't have the same problem of removing people from the labor force. This is just one example. So recommendations are fine, but they're rather abstract and vague, and I think some more concrete measures would have been interesting. And lastly, costly. I'm not saying, cost-benefit analysis. I'm not saying this is too costly. I'm just saying it's costly if we want to think about net zero, and we're thinking about, say, the automobile industry. We're talking about 800,000 workers or so. We can't use this as a model. That was my warning. Not that this is too costly for what you get out of it. I think that's something which is up for everyone to make their mind on.
There's only one short remark, because this is a very German debate, but let me give you one example why this is maybe costly, but it is an investment in the future of all of our countries. Because what we are buying with this investment is confidence. Confidence of people that we can organize transformation processes. And I fully agree with you. We will see also other transformation processes in the car manufacturing industry. And this industry is much larger in Germany. Everybody knows that. But if we wouldn't have spent money for buying trust and confidence by people, the next disruptive transformation process would have been much more difficult.
Thank you. Now we have the next question.
Nick Aberley. I'm Nick Aberley from Environment Victoria. We're a not-for-profit environment group here in Melbourne, working on climate change and energy. I just had a bit of a statement followed by a general question for the panel. Obviously, there are two main transitions that we're talking about here today. There's an energy transition. We heard a lot about that this morning. It's very hard, but we kind of know how to do it. There's a community transition. It's very hard, but we kind of know how to do it. I feel like the thing that was left unspoken in the panel was what makes both of these challenges even harder, certainly the community transition even harder, is the timescale that it needs to happen in. If we're going to sort this problem out, this energy and climate problem out, within the next 10 to 15 years, like we all in the room, I think, know that we need to start having quite a different conversation about what that community transition looks like. I think in Victoria, we'd been saying for quite some years to the Victorian government, look, Hazelwood's going to close, how about we start talking about that? And the government response was, oh, no, we can't talk about that, it'll scare the horses. I think we've improved a bit since Hazelwood closed. The government will now say the Latrobe Valley is a place where things might happen. But I think we're still a long way from open public conversations about the fact that your lawn is going to close very, very soon. And we kind of pretend that it won't. We're pretending that it won't, but it will. And that there are two other power stations in Latrobe Valley that need to close in the next 10 to 15 years. Most of the public conversation is, oh no, power stations will close, but that'll be 30 years away. That is not a real conversation, and it lulls the community into a false sense of the future. I think we've shown in Australia we're quite incapable up to now of having that conversation. You see what happened with Liddell, a company saying 7 years out ahead that we're going to close this power station, let's prepare for it, and now federal politicians are just losing their minds. So I'm just kind of really keen for the panel to unpack that. Amanda's nodding. I've had lots of conversations with Amanda about this kind of thing, but we'd love to hear comments from the Germans on the panel, actually, and obviously others as well, just about how we actually accelerate this conversation. Don't treat community transitions as something that we do once a power station is closed or 12 months before it closes. It has to start now. It has to start for all of them.
Can I make a really quick comment, even though you said you didn't want to hear from me?
No, I said I do.
I spent the last 2 years, well, I've been working on this for 5 years, but I spent the last 2 years because I could see from industry, from investors, from insurance companies, from government people at all levels, everyone was talking about this. Behind closed doors, everyone knows. And I was like, great, we just need to bring the right people together and feed them some ideas. And I talk a lot about Germany, and people go, oh, you can do it. And then we generate ideas. And then nothing has happened. The behind closed doors, yes. They go outside the room, nothing. And so I think that's the federal election result was, okay, we need to do much more focus on how do we generate the community support to make it politically safe for people who know what they need to do it. And that's not just political leaders, that's leaders in industry at a local government level, Chamber of Commerce. So I think that public-facing piece is where we've got to do work. But it has to be face-to-face. This is not about a messaging campaign or an advertising campaign. We've got to do more work in the regions. And one thing that's really effective is I get people from Latrobe Valley to come to Gladstone and they say, this has happened to us, you need to get on top of it. And there are economic benefits that we're starting to see now. So much more face-to-face work. Yep.
German top up.
I think it's a really good question and a really good observation. So I just want to build on Amanda's comments. So, you know, I've lived in this community for 25 years. We knew 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, generators were telling us that things were going to happen. So the word was out there. This is no surprise. We also need to understand, though, communities' acceptance. When I talked about grief, I'm really talking about grief. So you just cannot tell a community they need to get over it. So this is about long-term change in mindset, trust and confidence, relationships, and we are, as I said, we're tracking sentiment now. So the sentiment we're now seeing 2.5 years down the track is that people are now future thinking. And we're now not talking about coal, some people still are, but we're talking about where our competitive edge is, where our growth sectors are, what we can be good at. And people are starting to say that really matters, and we think we know we've now got a future beyond coal. I think it's also understanding the transition of energy, full stop, and that's a knowledge base, and so we're trying to work really hard on that as well. But it's the conversations every day, in every opportunity, that changes the way people think. And you have to demonstrate to people. It's not enough to tell people. They actually have to see. And again, it is now community leading those conversations. So we've got to build the conditions for that to happen. And collaboration becomes really important. So we've got some great opportunities on our doorstep. Investors now coming to us in the renewable energy sector, and people are excited about that. And we're saying it builds on the skills and the capability we do have in our community. And people can see now that there is a future. The sky hasn't fallen in. Talking about unemployment rates, the lowest ever, 3% at the moment. Locally, people can't believe that. So how does that happen? You do many, many things to create opportunities and jobs, and the confidence of a community becomes extremely important. That has to happen every day in every conversation.
Karen or Luke or Stefan, do you want to add anything from the German side?
Only one example from Germany. We finalized our report in January this year, and we had regional elections beginning of September in 2 of the affected federal states in Germany. And the cabinet, the German cabinet, needed 6 months to make the decision about the investment in the structural policies in these regions and in the investment situation. And they did it 3 days before the election. And what happened, in most of the constituencies in these regional states, which are affected by the coal phase-out, a right-wing populist party, which is denying climate change, won the constituencies. And I fully agree with you. Face-to-face communication and as fast as possible would have been needed. So communication and a real communication to people is relevant.
Thank you. Now we have the next question here.
Yeah, Ursula Fuentes from Murdoch University and Climate Analytics Australia. I wanted to come back to the point. That wasn't
sorry.
Signal for me. I wanted to come back to the point of whether this coal commission is a model for other countries, like for example for Australia, and I think that also relates to the question of what was delegated to the commission. So what was the commission asked to do, and that comes back to the question that has been raised also a few times. When we're talking about a transition, we're talking about a transition where to, I think one of the key points, and I think that was a key flaw of this construction, was that the question of where this transition has to go to, the question of when the coal phase-out is needed, that was also delegated to a group of interest groups because there wasn't enough, I guess, political leadership to decide it based on the political mandate. And so I'd like to hear from the panelists about this, after also having heard that there's a sort of an inbuilt tendency to get a slower transition if you ask the interest groups, and the question of whether the community is really then represented in such a commission. And I think it's interesting, and I'd also like to put that to the panel, that when you ask the community, and I've seen a recent analysis published in Nature about an analysis about the views in Germany, including in the affected regions, that they would support a much earlier coal phase out than than the recommendation of the Coal Commission. Similar also in Australia, there seems to be quite a wide support for a coal phase out when you ask. I mean, according to opinion polls that I have seen, even supporters of the coalition. So where is maybe the community and the society is further ahead than a group of interest groups. So this is something I would like to put to debate and ask the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you. I propose we have a German and an Australian answer to keep it a little bit contained. James, as a government representative, I would be quite interested in your view on how such a process could be successfully organized in the Australian context, hypothetically.
We won't quote you.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit hard. It's for us. I mean, we're not in as advanced. Taking the point that you've got to think these things ahead, well ahead. Certainly the Latrobe experience is probably one which might be better to sort of tease out rather than what we're seeing in New South Wales at the moment, but it's coming to us. So I'd be actually more interested in listening to how the Victorians might have thought about that and the German experience, because I think that's what we're here to learn.
Okay, Karen, with you.
Just on the comment on a coal commission, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to be able to comment on what has happened elsewhere and what that might mean for us. But I think one of the things that we've learnt, and when we talk about governance here and who represents who, when we talk about community, there are no community as many people. And we've got to think about the unusual suspects here. So one of the things that we think we need to understand is the voices of many people, not our traditional leaders who, sometimes think they represent the community. And I think one of the things we've learnt is there is no single governance arrangement here that we're operating on. So you bring people together to work on things that matter to them. And that is a purposeful piece of work, and that's a collaboration, and that might be something quite small or it might be something quite big. So we've got whole of region governance arrangements, we've got small localised governance arrangements, and the interaction between those becomes very important, and they're not static. So we use all of our social networks, all of our knowledge networks to bring people in and out of collaboration arrangements, and that's our governance model. So it's a very different way of thinking about community engagement, and not just engagement, we're talking about participation. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is measuring changes in activity, systems and attitude, and how people actually activate things, not just talk about it.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting what you mentioned, Ursula, the question of the mandate. So as far as I can remember, there's a reference to the German Climate Protection Plan 2030. And this has been criticized by other people already. I'm not being original here, but the German 2030 plan has a clause which refers to Paris, and in Paris we have a ratcheting up process which is dynamic. So this is going to change, and actually there's a planned ratcheting up at the end of this year, beginning of 2020, and the Coal Commission has planned its first re-evaluation 2023. So we have an issue here, and an issue which I think goes back to the question, have we really got confidence in this plan, 2038? We've heard today already maybe that coal firms will want to close their plants earlier, given CO2 prices, etc. So I'm not 100% sure that the confidence issue is really what we've really gained certainty here. What we have is a maximum amount that the federal government allows companies to use coal-fired power plants in Germany. We don't have certainty that these companies, private companies, they can put their capital elsewhere, will do this unless the sector will be nationalized. This is what we do with hot coal. We can do that, maybe, but, and then we have a broad consensus. The word consensus was used today, but it's not complete. So Fridays for Future, for example, have clearly positioned themselves against this program, and they've got a large base of support. The Green Party is toying with 2030 as a plan, and Bavaria, one of the countries which doesn't have much coal-fired power plants themselves, has also been arguing against it. So,
sorry to intervene. I'm really a little bit angry about this discussion because it's a very academic approach, and it's very easy to criticize all these aspects. First of all, the Green Party in Germany said from the beginning of the compromise that they want a one-by-one confirmation of this compromise by the parliament. Second aspect, in the commission, for example, Greenpeace was represented as well as other NGOs, and all these NGOs, except of one very local NGOs in one of the regions, agreed to the compromise. And that we have now a maximum date, how long is it possible to run a coal power plant in Germany? I think it's good news, because most of you will not know that we have some coal power plants in Germany. The owners are interested to close them down, but it's not possible because we have no alternatives in these regions for the production of the electricity. So it's very easy to criticize every different aspect. But you are interested in recommendations, what is helpful for our idea, and it's not copy-paste, that's very clear. One thing was very helpful. We had a very clear mandate of the government. And always when we had a discussion in this very fragmented and complex group of the Commission, should we also think about this aspect and should we discuss this aspect, we could go back to the mandate of the government and say, no, this is not our mandate. At the end, we were self-confident enough to look at all these aspects who are relevant that the compromise will work. But we always had a situation that we could reduce different other targets people were maybe interested to bring into the Commission, because the mandate of the government was very clear, and I think this is one aspect I would recommend to every other coal commissions in the world.
So I think now we have the gentleman from the trade unions.
It's a pity there's no trade unionist on the...
Yeah, we wanted to have...
Australian, yeah. Anyway, it would have been nice, we're in Australia, but there you go. And it was great to hear a bit of the tension between the Germans. Just don't let them drink too much afterwards. We don't want to see fisticuffs. The question about whether we have a coal commission or... I think the Latrobe Valley Authority has done fantastic work, and I think maybe that sort of model rolled out across the country might be the better approach. The fact is, it's not just about coal in Australia in many ways. I think we've got heavy industry plants that are at risk as well. They're not, you know, the Alcoa's aluminium plant at Portland, if that were to close, and it's quite an ageing piece of infrastructure, then that would have major ramifications for Western Victoria. So, and a lot of Australia's heavy industry is old and inefficient, to be honest, and we need to be thinking about that as well. So transitions, and you know, in northern Victoria, the issue is not coal. It's caused by coal, largely, but it's about water and the irrigation industry, and that's a big issue for New South Wales. So transition authorities that can deal with those issues more broadly, I think, is what we should be thinking about, and economic diversification in the regions as well, not just renewables. Because a major complaint that the trade union movement has in Australia is that renewable energy is not providing the job promise that it's always trumpeted as having. The quality of jobs is not good, and the security of employment is not good, and the number of jobs is not enough to make up for those workers who will be displaced from fossil fuel industry. Which takes me to my really important point, I think, in that the big difference between Germany and Australia, and there's been some differences of opinion on the nature of the transition in Germany, but in Australia we look at Germany and think, oh, if only we could manage it like that. But one of the big differences is that the German union movement is not treated as an enemy of the state, which the Australian union movement is treated by the Australian government. The ability to have the tripartite social dialogue in Germany is fantastic. We have no capacity to do that in Australia because, as I said, the Australian government is currently out to destroy, like completely eradicate the Australian union movement. And so for me, one of the most important aspects of energy policy and transition policy in Australia is actually industrial relations law. It's almost impossible for union. We have the most repressive trade union law in the OECD in this country now. It's incredibly difficult for unions to go out and organise workers, to represent workers, to drive up the security of standards. And if you're trying to organise a renewable energy industry, which is entirely non-union largely, unlike the fossil fuel industry, which is heavily unionised with good jobs, it's incredibly difficult to do it. And it's incredibly difficult to go out to workers and say, we're going to have an emissions reduction target and let the market rip. And the workers say, what a load of shit. What are you telling me? We don't believe any of that. And there's no reason why they should believe it. Because every industry restructure in this country, from the car industry, textile clothing and footwear, the workers got screwed. No, and then the workers believe that will happen again when the fossil fuel industry close. It shouldn't have to be like that. But we need to have these sorts of things that people are talking about, but we have to have a fundamental change of attitude towards workers and trade unions in this country.
I take this as a comment, and it was not a question. So,
can I just say, I think it's a really important comment, because the union voice has been missing in that perspective. We talk about community, but work it's a very specific thing. So I want to say thank you for that, because I think it was missing from the discussion today.
Can you just say very briefly that we have the same issue in Germany, that the coal-fired industry is much better organised, pays much higher wages, and renewables, where lots of jobs were lost in the last few years, are very, very badly organised. So.
Thanks very much. Paul Vervold from the Australian National University. Just wanted to pick up on one of the comments before about face-to-face, I guess, interaction between communities and government. And when I think of face-to-face interaction in an Australian context over a contentious issue, I think of two photos that were taken on the same day in a place called Griffith. And this was when the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which is the authority in Australia looking at recovering environmental water in our major food growing area, stood up and spoke to a group of irrigators and said, tried to explain to them that they were planning, how they were planning to potentially put together a plan, and I'm using those words very deliberately, to buy back water voluntarily. And the second photo, and in that photo there was a group of government officials up on a stage higher than that one and a group of very angry people on the other side. And the second photo was of groups of irrigators after that meeting burning the draft guide to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And in the media also saying afterwards, we're not going to let them take our water away from us. Now, in Australia, and obviously in Germany as well, there are a lot of risks for policymakers to engage face-to-face with communities, particularly when there's a trust deficit. I'm wondering if the panel could comment on how those risks can be managed.
I think there's a couple of points that I didn't pick up on earlier, and I think the mandate point in the many conversations, and I'll go to an entirely different example. In 2011, I was seconded and volunteered to be part of the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority in Christchurch after the earthquakes. And we created an organisation of it, you call it the Coal Commission, but we created the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, urgent legislation passed in 2 weeks. And it was meant to be all seeing, all thinking, all doing. And one of the transactions I led was the effectively the planned evacuation of 8,000 homes. 160,000 homes in Christchurch, 100,000 damaged, 8,000 beyond repair. And what I learned from that, and I think the point is really powerful here for that transition, is that point of that multiple conversation. You just can't do it just by declaring it. You can't do it with the power. Even if you've got powers, even if you've got mandate, you do have to have conversations. So I hear what you're saying, and it's about each context requires a different conversation. I think that's what you were saying to Karen.
Maybe it certainly is, and I think I haven't talked about our relationship, up the line in terms of government departments or government. So it's not just about a local conversation. We advocate. So we have a really interesting role. We are advocating into government, even though we're a government authority. So part of our job is to really tell the true story about what's happening in place to influence policy change and practice change. I've just come out of a meeting this morning to say, if you work this way in government, the way we're working, you could do this everywhere in every community, regardless of what it is. And I come back to the point that was made earlier about how rural and regional areas in Australia, and I'd say more internationally as well, are feeling about the divide between city and rural. And there's a growing gap there. And communities feeling left behind. We've just seen that play out in the last national election here. So we need to really understand how the intersection between policy and on the ground, and we need to be saying that these are not places to be fixed. Our language needs to change. These are strong, proud communities who need to be recognised for what they contribute to the prosperity of the state here. So let's stop talking about it as a problem to be fixed by people and saying in partnership, we need to harness all of that strength in a community, and that's the conversation we've got to build across many people. So we work directly with department people on the ground. So that's one of the things we've said, no, don't talk about it in Melbourne in here. You come down and work with us. And that's starting to happen. And Colin's been part of those conversations where we've had central people now working on things with people side by side on what matters. But that's long-term, constant, continuous iteration and evolution.
We need to wrap up already, and I would like to do this by putting you all here on the panel on the spot. Just 30-second statement. What is the major pitfall you think we need to avoid managing the transition over the coming decade, and where's the biggest opportunity? Who wants to go first?
I'll start with where the opportunity is. I think there is the consensus point before that there was consensus in Australia that we need transition. There's definitely some very deep divides, and it's not just about this. It's actually about a long history of how economic neoliberal policies as well that have left regions hurting, that's actually about a lot of other things, and it's the identity and people feeling abandoned and left behind, and they've been let down, and that government doesn't have their back, and they can't trust experts anymore, and the unions aren't there. So, people are feeling angry and fearful, and that's scary, but it's also a really good opportunity to have some real conversations about this country and where we're going, and people want to have it. Like, people keep saying, wow, you're really brave going into coal communities. I'm like, people welcome this conversation if you go in to listen, and if you do go in exactly what Karen was saying with, tell me about this place, what are your strengths, where do you want to go, what's already working here, and how do we build on that and support that, and who can I connect you with that's going to help that process?
Thank you. Luke, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think I spoke a lot about pitfalls. I've deflated people and criticized other people. So let me say something positive. I think it's really important to bring people together to the table. I think it's an impressive achievement that the German Coal Commission, for example, as one of different forums, achieved, of getting people of very different backgrounds together. And I think ideally we would want to combine that with even more focus on the positive vision that Karen has spoken a lot about. Where do we want to go with this area, and not just how do we want to deal with the negative aspects of closing an industry down. So that would be my pitch.
Stefan.
From my perspective, it would be very dangerous if we would forget that daily life and real life for people in the regions is very real and sometimes very different to the situation we have in our capitals. And the priorities different peoples in democratic, open societies have are very various. Sometimes we believe if this is our key priority, number one, it should be the key priority of normal people in their daily life as well, and it isn't. And this is a very dangerous situation.
Thank you. Karen?
I think one of the pitfalls is wanting to speed things up and defaulting back to defaulting ways of working. And you learn very quickly when you've made a mistake, and being honest and open about, we've got this wrong. Let's go back and start again at the table about that. Sometimes you get into those situations where you really need to come back to some basics. So for us, we've learnt that, and we continue to learn, and I think it's about continual learning.
Thank you. James?
I think there are some imperatives we've spent a lot of the day talking about. There's the vision, and I think it's that outcomes and thinking about those outcomes. For any transition has people who are winners and losers, if you like, and you've got to sort of recognise that, you've got to understand it. So it is about communicating that and understanding that and thinking about how people will buy into a vision. So especially in this area, this is important.
Thank you so much, and I would like to give a big hand to the excellent panel. And my fear was that again Malte would be standing between you and the reception, and I'm very happy that it's Rebecca.
And I promise I will be very, very brief. It's been a long day, but that was a fantastic discussion and very lively. There was no sense we were sliding down in terms of the emotion and the quality of the discussion. So thank you all. It's been a really, really interesting day. I think that I'm not going to spend a lot of time recapping. I realise I'm now standing between you and a drink. I did think that there are a couple of things that it's worth calling out. One is that it is absolutely clear that there's a consensus that we have a major transition to manage in a very short space of time, and that there are an enormous number of issues to be addressed in both Germany and Australia, and the diversity of views around not the direction, but the manner in which those issues could be addressed that's come through on the German side is always really, really heartening to hear in Australia, because from the outside at first blush, sometimes it seems like there's a real coherency of that there isn't this level of disagreement, and that the issues are all so easy in Germany because you're heading straight for the goal. I think the other thing that's absolutely apparent is how many solutions there are at a multitude of levels, and that all of them and many of them need to be in play. And as part of that, I think the other thing that's come through is the mutual learning opportunities. So there are clearly things where the long-term planning that is evident in the German debate and the sense of where things are headed and the consensus around that, whether that is around transmission planning and a long-term vision on that, or whether it's around a coal commission and the idea you can set targets for 2038. That is clearly of enormous value. And in contrast, in Australia, we managed to rethink our policy direction pretty much every year, maybe every two, and that comes at a great cost. It is also, I think, means we're quite a good policy laboratory in some respects. And there are also obvious learnings from Australia, or areas where there are real insights. So whether that's around the way in which storage solutions like batteries are being integrated into the grid in a much tighter supply and demand system, I think there's, it's really evident. And whether some of these more community-driven approaches to economic renewal could be a very important way in which the conversation could then be taken forward. So, there are many, I could go on, but I won't. Thank you all for all of your attention and contribution today. We will now head through for a reception where we will be joined also by the delegation funded by the Ministry for Education and Research, BMBF, and the Vice-Chancellor of the Melbourne University. And so we invite you to come and join us for that. And thank again the ministries who have hosted today, DoEE and BMWi. And one small housekeeping matter, because of course housekeeping is seems to be my job today. Could you hand, when you leave this evening after the reception, your lanyards in at the bottom? And I know we'll see many of you, but not all of you tomorrow, and you'll receive them again tomorrow, and there'll also be new people joining us tomorrow as well. So we look forward to a lot of conversations that will focus more on many of the complementary opportunities for Germany and Australia in the energy transition, and in particular around trade. So it's already apparent that Australia feels it has an enormous potential as a hydrogen producer. Germany feels it has an enormous potential as a consumer. There are also a lot of, that's useful. And similarly, the innovation around some of the technology issues that have already come to the fore today, where Germany is clearly leading in some of those spaces. I think that'll be a lively conversation tomorrow. So we look forward to seeing you then as well. Thank you.